My wife died years ago. Since then, I've been both father and mother to our little girl. No matter how tight things got, I sent $300 every month to my mother-in-law, Margaret, who lived alone after losing her daughter. I thought it was the last duty of a decent husband. I never missed a single month. Until the day I discovered something that made me realize not every sacrifice is received the way you think it is. So all these years, who was I really helping? I'm an electrician. I fix things, breaker boxes, wiring, outlets that stopped working years ago. It's honest work, and it used to be enough. Emily always said I had good hands. She'd watch me strip a wire or splice a connection and smile like I was doing something more important than I really was. That was her way. She made small things feel big. We met at a diner where she worked weekends during college. I came in one morning with paint still under my nails from helping a friend renovate his kitchen, and she brought me coffee without asking if I wanted a refill. 3 months later, I proposed in the parking lot of that same diner because I couldn't wait any longer. She laughed and said yes before I even finished the question. We got married at a courthouse with 2 witnesses we didn't know, and it felt like the biggest day of my life. Lucy came 2 years later, 8 pounds, 6 ounces. Emily held her and cried, and I realized I'd never been afraid of anything until that moment. Life was simple. We lived in a rental house with a yard big enough for Lucy to play in. Emily worked part-time at a medical office doing billing, and I took whatever jobs I could get. We didn't have much, but we didn't need much either. On Sundays, we'd drive to the lake and let Lucy throw rocks into the water while Emily packed sandwiches in a cooler we bought at a yard sale. Those were the best days, the kind you don't appreciate fully until they're gone. The accident happened on a Tuesday. Emily was driving home from work. A truck ran a red light and hit her on the driver's side. The police said she died instantly, but I don't know if that's something they tell everyone, or if it was true. I didn't ask. At the funeral, I couldn't look at the casket. I kept my eyes on Lucy, who didn't understand why everyone was crying or why her mom wasn't coming home. She asked me that night if Mommy was mad at her. I told her no. I told her Mommy loved her more than anything. I didn't know what else to say. Margaret came to the funeral alone. She'd lost her husband years before, and now she'd lost her only daughter. I watched her stand by the casket for a long time, not crying, just staring. When she finally walked over to me, she looked smaller than I remembered. She took my hand and said Emily had been lucky to have me. I didn't feel lucky. I felt like I'd failed at the one thing that mattered. After the service, we stood outside while people I barely knew told me they were sorry. Margaret pulled me aside and said she didn't know how she'd go on without Emily. I told her I didn't either, but we'd figure it out. She looked at me and said she didn't have anyone else now. I said she had me. I said I'd make sure she was okay. I meant it. The first few months after Emily died were a blur. I had to keep working because the bills didn't stop. And Lucy needed me to hold things together, even when I didn't know how. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning, make her breakfast, drop her off at school, and spend the day crawling through attics or crouched in basements, fixing electrical problems I could actually solve. At night, I'd help her with homework, make dinner, and try not to let her see me fall apart. She'd ask about Emily sometimes, and I'd tell her stories about the things her mom used to do. The way she sang off-key in the car, the way she'd dance in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. Lucy would smile, but I could see the sadness underneath. She was 8 years old and trying to be brave for me. That's not something a kid should have to do. Margaret called a few weeks after the funeral. She said she was struggling. She said the house felt too empty and she didn't know how to keep going. I told her to come stay with us for a while, but she said she couldn't leave her home. It was where she'd raised Emily, and it was all she had left of her. I understood that. I told her I'd help however I could. She didn't ask for money directly, but she mentioned the bills piling up and the furnace that needed repairs. I sent her $200 that month. It wasn't much, but it was what I could spare. The next month, she called again. She said the roof was leaking and the car needed new tires. I sent $300. It became a routine after that. Every month, I'd transfer $300 into her account. She'd thank me and say she didn't know what she'd do without me. I told her it was the least I could do. Emily would have wanted me to take care of her mother, and I wasn't going to let her down. Not again. Lucy started asking why we couldn't go to the movies anymore, or why she couldn't get new shoes when hers wore out. I told her we had to be careful with money, and she accepted it without complaint. She was a good kid. Too good. She'd wear the same jacket all winter, even though it was too small, and she never asked for anything beyond what she needed. I'd see other kids at her school with new backpacks or toys, and I'd feel the weight of everything I couldn't give her. But I told myself it was temporary. I told myself things would get better. Margaret never asked how we were doing. She'd call and talk about her own problems, and I'd listen because I thought that's what Emily would have done. She said her health was failing and she couldn't afford her medications. She said the neighbors were loud and she couldn't sleep. She said she felt forgotten by everyone except me. I kept sending the money, every month, $300. I didn't have a contract or an agreement. I didn't ask for receipts or explanations. I just did it because it felt like the right thing to do. 2 years passed like that. Then 3. Lucy grew taller, and I grew more tired. The work didn't stop, and the money never stretched far enough. I started taking on extra jobs, working weekends and late nights just to keep up. I'd come home and find Lucy asleep on the couch with her homework half finished, and I'd feel like I was failing her the same way I'd failed Emily. But I kept going, because that's what you do. You keep going even when you don't know why anymore. One night, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, looking at the bank account. It was the end of the month, and I needed to send Margaret her money. But the balance was lower than I expected. I started going through the transactions, trying to figure out where everything had gone. Rent, groceries, utilities, Lucy's school supplies, the car payment. It was all there, adding up to more than I made. I'd been running on fumes for so long, I hadn't realized how bad it had gotten. I looked at the transfer I was about to make, $300. It didn't seem like much when I sent it every month, but seeing it in the context of everything else made it feel different. I thought about Margaret and what she'd told me, the bills, the repairs, the medications. I thought about the promise I'd made at the funeral. Then I thought about Lucy and the jacket she'd worn all winter. I thought about the school trip she couldn't go on because I didn't have the $60 for the fee. I thought about the fact that I'd been working myself into the ground for 3 years and still couldn't make ends meet. I didn't send the money that night. I told myself I'd do it in the morning after I figured out where to pull it from. But the next day, I started thinking about something Margaret had said during our last call. She'd mentioned going to visit a friend out of state. It was a small detail, and I almost missed it. But it stuck with me because she'd told me a few months earlier that she couldn't afford to leave the house. I didn't think much of it at the time. People say things. But now, it felt off. I went back through our messages and phone calls, piecing together the things she'd told me over the years. The furnace, the roof, the car, the medications. She'd painted a picture of someone barely surviving, and I'd believed her because I wanted to, because it made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. But now I wasn't sure. I didn't want to doubt her. She was Emily's mother, and Emily had loved her. But something didn't add up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. The money was already a day late, and I knew Margaret would call soon to ask about it. I could send it and move on. I could keep doing what I'd always done and pretend I didn't notice the inconsistencies. Or I could look closer. I could ask questions. I could find out if the person I'd been helping all these years was the person I thought she was. It felt wrong to even consider it, like I was betraying Emily by doubting her mother. But I thought about Lucy asleep in the next room, and I thought about the years I'd spent working myself to exhaustion while telling her we had to be careful with money. I thought about the promise I'd made at the funeral, and I wondered if keeping that promise meant sacrificing everything else. I didn't know the answer, but I knew I couldn't keep going the way I had been. Something had to change. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. I thought about Emily and what she would have wanted. I thought about Margaret and the $300 I sent every month. And I thought about the question I'd been avoiding for 3 years. Who was I really helping? Margaret called 2 days later. I was in the middle of replacing a circuit breaker at a commercial building when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't answer, but I knew she'd keep calling until I did. I stepped outside into the cold and pressed the phone to my ear. She asked if everything was all right because she hadn't received the money yet. Her voice had that edge to it, the one that made me feel like I'd done something wrong. I told her I'd been busy with work and I'd send it soon. She said she understood, but reminded me that her bills didn't wait. I said I knew. She thanked me and hung up. I stood there in the parking lot watching my breath fog in the air. The conversation had lasted less than 2 minutes, but it left me feeling hollow. I sent the $300 that afternoon because I didn't know what else to do. But the question stayed with me. I couldn't stop thinking about the trip she'd mentioned, the one to visit a friend out of state. It didn't fit with the person she'd described to me over the years, the person who couldn't afford to leave the house or pay for basic repairs. That weekend, I decided to look closer. I wasn't trying to catch her in a lie. I just wanted to understand. I went through old messages and emails, looking for patterns or details I might have missed. She'd told me about the furnace breaking down in January 2 years ago. She'd said it cost $800 to fix. I'd sent her $300 that month and another $200 the next. But in a message from March, she'd mentioned how cold the house still was. If the furnace had been fixed, why was she still complaining about the cold? I found more inconsistencies the longer I looked. She'd told me the roof needed repairs after a storm, but months later, she mentioned water damage in the attic that she couldn't afford to address. If the roof had been fixed, where had the water come from? She'd said her car needed new tires, but a year later, she was still talking about how unsafe it was to drive. None of it made sense unless the money I'd been sending wasn't going where she said it was. I didn't want to believe it. Margaret was Emily's mother. She'd raised the woman I loved, and I'd promised to take care of her. But the evidence was there, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I thought about calling her and asking directly, but I didn't know how to start that conversation. What would I even say? I decided to wait. Maybe there was an explanation I hadn't considered. Maybe I was reading too much into things. A few days later, I ran into an old coworker at a supply store. We'd worked together years ago, and he asked how I was doing. I told him I was managing. He mentioned that he'd seen Margaret recently at a restaurant downtown. He said she looked good, healthier than he remembered. I asked when this was, and he said it had been a few weeks ago. She'd been with someone, a younger man he didn't recognize. They'd seemed close, laughing and talking like old friends. He said he almost went over to say hello, but he didn't want to interrupt. I thanked him and left. The whole drive home, I kept replaying what he'd said. Margaret had told me she barely left the house because of her health. She'd said she couldn't afford to go out or do anything beyond the basics, but she'd been at a restaurant with someone. Looking healthy, I didn't know what to make of it. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe a friend had treated her. But it didn't align with the picture she'd painted for me. That night, I did something I'm not proud of. I looked her up on social media. I'd never thought to do it before because she'd always said she didn't use those sites. But I found her profile after a few searches. It was set to private, but I could see her profile picture. It was recent. She was smiling, standing in front of a beach with the ocean behind her. The photo had been posted 3 months ago. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. She'd told me that same month that she couldn't afford her medications and needed help with the bills. But she'd been at the beach. She'd been on vacation. I clicked through to see if there was anything else I could access. There wasn't much, but I found a comment on one of her posts from someone named David. He'd written something about how great it was to see her and how he was glad she was doing better. I didn't know who David was. Margaret had never mentioned him, but the comment suggested they were close. Close enough that he knew about her health and her life. I felt sick, not because she had friends or because she'd gone to the beach, but because she'd lied. She'd told me she was struggling, that she couldn't afford to live, and I'd believed her. I'd sent her thousands of dollars over the years while my own daughter went without. I called her the next day. I didn't plan what I was going to say, and maybe that was a mistake. When she answered, I asked her directly about the trip to the beach. There was silence on the other end. Then she asked how I knew about that. I told her I'd seen the photo. She said it wasn't what it looked like. Her friend David had paid for everything, and she'd only gone because he insisted. She said she'd been embarrassed to tell me because she didn't want me to think she was doing fine without my help. I asked why she'd told me she couldn't afford her medications that same month if she'd been well enough to travel. She said the trip had been planned before her health took a turn. She said I was twisting things and making her feel guilty for trying to have one good moment in an otherwise difficult life. I didn't know what to say. She made it sound like I was the one being unreasonable, like I was punishing her for finding a sliver of happiness. But it wasn't about the trip. It was about the lies. It was about the fact that I'd been killing myself to send her money while she was living a life she'd told me she couldn't afford. I asked her about the furnace and the roof and the car. I asked her if any of it had been true. She started crying. She said she couldn't believe I was interrogating her like this. She said Emily would be ashamed of me for doubting her mother. That hit harder than anything else. I told her I wasn't trying to hurt her, but I needed to understand. She said there was nothing to understand. She said if I didn't trust her, then maybe I shouldn't send the money anymore. Then she hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling like I'd just made a terrible mistake. Maybe I had. Maybe I'd misread everything. Maybe there were explanations I hadn't considered, but the doubt was there now, and I couldn't shake it. I thought about calling her back and apologizing, but I didn't. Instead, I went to pick up Lucy from school. She was waiting outside with a group of other kids, and when she saw me, she ran over and hugged me like she always did. She told me about a project she was working on in class, something about the solar system. She was excited, talking fast and smiling. I realized I hadn't seen her smile like that in a long time. On the way home, she asked if we could stop for ice cream. I almost said no out of habit. We didn't have the money for things like that. But then I thought about the $300 I'd sent Margaret that month. I thought about the beach photo and the restaurant and the lies. I pulled into the parking lot of a small shop near our house and told Lucy to pick whatever she wanted. She looked at me like I'd just given her the world. She ordered a double scoop of chocolate chip, and we sat outside on a bench even though it was cold. She talked about school and her friends and a book she was reading. I listened and tried not to think about anything else. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over the conversation with Margaret, replaying every word. She'd made me feel guilty for asking questions, and part of me wondered if she was right. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe I was looking for problems that didn't exist. But then I thought about the money. $300 a month for 3 years. That was almost $11,000. Money I could have used to give Lucy a better life. $10,000 that could have paid for school trips and new clothes, and the things she needed, but never asked for. I felt angry, not just at Margaret, but at myself. I'd been so focused on keeping a promise to a dead woman that I'd forgotten about the living one sleeping in the next room. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I didn't want to, but I had to know. I called a mutual friend of Emily's, someone who'd stayed in touch with Margaret over the years. I asked her casually if she'd heard from Margaret recently. She said she had. They'd talked a few weeks ago, and Margaret had mentioned she was doing well. She'd said her son had been helping her out, and things were looking up. I asked what son. The friend seemed surprised by the question. She said Margaret's son, David, the one who lived a few hours away. I thanked her and hung up. Margaret had never told me she had a son who could help her. In all the years I'd known her, she'd never mentioned him taking care of her. Not once. I thought back to the funeral and the months after. She'd said she didn't have anyone. She'd said Emily was all she had. But she had a son who was apparently helping her, a son who'd taken her to the beach and paid for her meals. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me. Everything she'd told me had been a lie. Not just a small lie or a misunderstanding, but a deliberate deception. She'd let me believe she was alone and struggling while her son took care of her. She'd taken my money knowing I was barely getting by. She'd used my guilt and my love for Emily to manipulate me. I didn't call her. I didn't know what I'd say if I did. Instead, I sat down and calculated how much I'd sent her over the years. It came to $10,800. Almost $11,000. That was more than I made in 4 months. That was a year of Lucy's school expenses. That was a car repair or a down payment on a better place to live. That was everything I'd sacrificed. And it had been for nothing. Margaret didn't need my help. She'd never needed it. She just wanted it. And I'd been too broken and too desperate to keep Emily's memory alive to see it. Lucy came home from school that afternoon and found me sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out in front of me. She asked if everything was okay. I told her it was. She looked at me like she didn't believe me, but she didn't push. She just sat down next to me and started her homework. I watched her work, her pencil moving across the page, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was so much like Emily, the same determination, the same quiet strength. And I'd been failing her. I'd been so focused on honoring Emily's memory that I'd forgotten what Emily would have actually wanted. She would have wanted me to take care of our daughter. She would have wanted Lucy to have everything she needed. She wouldn't have wanted me to sacrifice our future for a lie. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to send Margaret any more money. I didn't know how she'd react, and I didn't care. I was done. I was done lying to myself about what was right. I was done letting guilt control my life. I was done putting someone else's needs above my daughter's. It felt like the first clear thought I'd had in years, but it also felt terrifying. Because I knew what would come next. Margaret would call. She'd demand an explanation. She'd guilt me and manipulate me and try to make me feel like I was abandoning her. And part of me was afraid I'd give in. Part of me was afraid I'd go back to the way things were, because it was easier than standing my ground. I looked at Lucy sleeping in her room, her face peaceful in the dim light from the hallway. I thought about all the times I'd told her we couldn't afford something. All the times she'd accepted it without complaint because she didn't want to make things harder for me. She deserved better. She deserved a father who put her first, and I was going to be that father, even if it meant breaking a promise I'd made 3 years ago, even if it meant letting go of the last connection I had to Emily. Because Emily wasn't in Margaret. Emily was in Lucy, and Lucy needed me. Margaret called 3 days later. I was at work, up on a ladder running wire through a ceiling, when my phone started buzzing in my pocket. I didn't answer. She called again an hour later, then again that evening. I let it ring each time. I knew what she wanted, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation. But she didn't stop. Over the next week, she called at least twice a day. She left voicemails asking if I was okay, if Lucy was okay, if something had happened. Her voice shifted between concern and irritation, and I could hear the edge creeping in. She knew. She knew I wasn't going to send the money. On the 8th day, I finally answered. I was sitting in my truck outside Lucy's school, waiting to pick her up, and I couldn't avoid it anymore. Margaret's voice came through sharp and direct. She asked why I'd been ignoring her. I told her I'd been busy. She said that wasn't an excuse. She said she'd been waiting for the money, and it still hadn't come. Her bills were piling up, and she didn't know what she was going to do. I took a breath and told her I wasn't going to send it anymore. The silence that followed felt heavy. Then she asked what I meant. I said exactly what I'd said. I couldn't keep sending her $300 every month. She asked why, and I told her I'd found out about David. I told her I knew she had a son who'd been helping her. I told her I'd seen the photos and talked to people and pieced together the truth. She didn't deny it. Instead, she got angry. She said David was her business and had nothing to do with me. She said the money I sent was separate, that it was my responsibility as Emily's husband. I told her Emily was gone, and I had a daughter to take care of. Margaret's voice broke. She started crying, saying I was abandoning her just like everyone else. She said Emily would never forgive me for treating her mother this way. She said I was selfish and cruel, that I'd made a promise, and now I was breaking it. I felt the guilt rising in my chest, the same guilt that had kept me sending money for 3 years. But this time, I pushed through it. I told her I wasn't abandoning her. I told her she had a son, and she'd been lying to me about how bad things were. I said I couldn't keep sacrificing my daughter's future for something that wasn't real. She screamed at me then. She said I didn't know what it was like to lose a child. She said I had no idea what she'd been through, and that the least I could do was honor Emily's memory by taking care of her. I told her I was honoring Emily by taking care of Lucy. That's what Emily would have wanted. Margaret said I was using Lucy as an excuse to justify my selfishness. She said I was a coward and a liar, and that Emily had made a mistake marrying me. Then she hung up. I sat in the truck with the phone still in my hand, feeling like I'd been hit. The words she'd said played over and over in my mind. Part of me wanted to call her back and apologize. Part of me wanted to send the money just to make it stop. But I didn't. I saw Lucy walking out of the school with her backpack bouncing on her shoulders, and I knew I'd made the right choice. She climbed into the truck and asked if I was okay. I told her I was. She smiled and started talking about her day, and I listened and tried to let the sound of her voice drown out everything else. Margaret called again the next day, and the day after that. I stopped answering. She left voicemails that started out pleading and ended angry. She said I owed her. She said I was breaking my promise. She said she'd tell everyone what kind of person I really was. I deleted the messages without listening to all of them. I didn't block her number because I thought maybe she'd eventually stop. But she didn't. The calls kept coming, sometimes multiple times a day. I started leaving my phone on silent and only checking it when I had to. A few weeks passed. The calls slowed down but didn't stop completely. I used the $300 I would have sent her to take Lucy shopping for new clothes. We went to a store she liked, and I told her to pick out whatever she needed. She looked at me like she didn't believe it, but then she started pulling things off the racks. Jeans that actually fit, a jacket that wasn't too small, shoes that didn't have holes in the soles. When we got to the register, the total came to $240. I paid without hesitating. On the way home, Lucy thanked me 3 times. I told her she didn't have to thank me. I told her this was how it should have been all along. That night, I sat down and made a budget, a real one. I wrote down everything we needed and everything we could afford. For the first time in years, the numbers added up. I had enough to cover rent and groceries and utilities with a little left over. Not much, but enough. Enough to take Lucy out for ice cream once in a while. Enough to say yes when she asked for something small. Enough to stop feeling like I was drowning every single day. It felt like I could finally breathe. I thought about Margaret sometimes. I wondered if she was okay. if David was really taking care of her, or if I'd misjudged the situation. But every time I started to doubt myself, I thought about the lies, the beach photo, the restaurant, the son she'd never mentioned. She hadn't needed my help. She'd just wanted it, and I'd given it because I thought it was my duty. But doing the right thing doesn't mean letting someone take advantage of you. It doesn't mean sacrificing your own family for someone who's lying to you. One evening, about a month after I'd stopped sending the money, Lucy and I were sitting on the couch watching a movie. She looked up at me during a commercial break and asked if we were doing better now. I asked her what she meant. She said things felt different. We had food in the fridge, and she had new clothes, and I didn't seem as tired anymore. I told her we were doing better. She said she was glad. Then she asked if Grandma Margaret was mad at me. I didn't know Lucy had noticed the calls or the tension. I told her Grandma Margaret and I had a disagreement, but it was between adults, and she didn't need to worry about it. Lucy nodded and went back to watching the movie. Later that night, after Lucy went to bed, I pulled out an old photo album. I hadn't looked at it in years because it hurt too much, but I needed to see Emily's face. I needed to remind myself why I'd made the promise in the first place. I flipped through the pages, looking at pictures of our wedding and the day Lucy was born and all the small moments in between. Emily smiling in the kitchen, Emily holding Lucy at the park, Emily laughing at something I'd said. She looked so alive in those photos, so full of light. I missed her so much it felt like a physical ache. I stopped on a picture of the three of us together. Lucy was maybe 2 years old, sitting between us on a blanket at the lake. Emily had her arm around me, and we were both looking at Lucy, who was holding a dandelion and grinning. It was one of those perfect moments you don't realize is perfect until it's gone. I stared at the photo for a long time, and I thought about what Emily would say if she were here. I thought about whether she'd be angry with me for stopping the payments to her mother, and I realized she wouldn't be. Emily had always put Lucy first. She would have wanted me to do the same. I closed the album and put it back on the shelf. I didn't need to keep punishing myself for a promise I'd made when I was drowning in grief. I'd done my best. I'd tried to honor Emily's memory by taking care of her mother, and I'd done it for as long as I could. But I couldn't do it anymore. Not at the cost of Lucy's future. Not at the cost of my own sanity. And that was okay. It had to be. The calls from Margaret eventually stopped. I don't know if she gave up or if she just moved on to someone else. Part of me felt relief. Part of me felt guilt. But mostly, I felt free. Free from the weight of a promise that had been crushing me for 3 years. Free to focus on the person who actually needed me. Free to be the father Lucy deserved. A few months later, Lucy came home from school with a permission slip for a field trip. She was 11 now, taller and more independent than the 8-year-old who'd lost her mother. It was to a science museum a few hours away, and the cost was $75. She handed it to me without saying anything, like she already knew the answer would be no. I looked at the slip and then at her, and I saw the resignation in her eyes, the same resignation I'd seen too many times before. I told her to get a pen. She asked why, and I said because I needed to sign the form. Her face lit up. She asked if I was serious, and I told her I was. She hugged me so hard I thought she might break a rib. That night, I tucked her into bed and sat on the edge of her mattress like I used to when she was little. She asked if we were going to be okay. I told her we were. She said she loved me, and I told her I loved her too. After she fell asleep, I stood in the doorway and watched her for a while. She looked peaceful, safe, happy. And I realized that was all that mattered. Not the promises I'd made, not the guilt I carried. Just her. Just making sure she had the life she deserved. Kindness isn't wrong, but kindness without boundaries will hurt the people you're supposed to protect the most. Being a good son-in-law doesn't mean sacrificing your child's future. Keeping a promise doesn't mean accepting being used. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is know when to stop.